Welcome, folks. I wanted to give an introduction to hierarchical clustering, dendrograms, and in particular, I'll be talking about single linkage clustering, which is one version of hierarchical clustering, but it's not the only version. It's the simplest version, and that's why I'm discussing it. So how many clusters do you see here? Maybe you see 3 clusters, or maybe you only see 2 clusters, or maybe if you have really good eyesight, maybe you see 1 cluster for each data point. So there's no right answer regarding how many clusters are there in a data set. And hierarchical clustering really takes that approach. In hierarchical clustering, you don't try to give one answer in terms of how many clusters there are. You try to show, well, as we blur our vision more and more, this is how the data set clusters into fewer and fewer, but larger and larger groups as we blur our vision. So, here we might start with 1 cluster for each data point, but maybe we group into 3 different clusters. And then if we blur our vision a little bit more, maybe we group the yellow and green clusters together, right? So already I'm showing you a hierarchical clustering in that transition from 25 clusters to 3 clusters to 2 clusters. And then you could go even further to 1 cluster after this. There are many, many different types of hierarchical clustering. Let me just talk about the simplest, single linkage clustering. All right, so what you do is you start with your data points and you have some scale. Okay, and you're going to grow that scale, so that scale is a real number. And maybe you start with 1/10, then 2/10, then 3/10, then 4/10, dot, 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 all the way up to 1, and then 1.1, 1.2, etc. And as you increase that scale, you throw in all edges that are at most that current scale. So when the scale is small, we just have these very short edges that appear. And then as the scale increases, more and more edges enter. Let's see, already at this stage, we've reduced down to 5 clusters, okay? So at 1 scale, this data set clusters into 5 groups. We could keep going, adding in more edges. Here we're down to 3 clusters. And so you can see at a different scale, the data set clusters into 3 groups. Still 3 clusters, down to 2 clusters, and finally 1 large cluster that remains 1 cluster even as you increase the scale further. All right, so I want to introduce this tree-like structure that I've drawn down below, which is called the dendrogram. So a dendrogram is a way to keep track of this clustering information as the scale changes. So what we'll see in the dendrogram is the following. Scale will be on the horizontal axis of the dendrogram. And when I'm at this scale, the fact that I intersect 5 lines means that my data set currently consists of 5 clusters. Okay, and now let's increase the scale by moving this gray line to the right. So as I increase the scale, I can see that at this scale I have 3 clusters right here. Okay, so let's go through the entire progression in this dendrogram. Okay, when we start in this dendrogram, we have 1 sort of line in the dendrogram for every single data point. And we're going to track how these data points merge as the scale increases. So let's increase the scale. We add in some edges. And you can see that these 2 data points have merged into just 1 group. And maybe these 2 data points have merged into just 1 group. You can increase the scale more. At this stage, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 clusters. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Increase the scale more. I think we're down to about 6 clusters. And now here we're down to 5 clusters. You've already seen this picture before. This is the one that I drew previously with colors. So I've tracked for you what are all the green data points that merge together into this cluster. And what are all the yellow data points that merge together by the scale into that cluster? And etc. for the blue, red, and brown clusters. So it's sort of nice. You can see that right here, I have a brown cluster consisting of 2 data points. And I have a red cluster consisting of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 data points. You can really see a lot about the clustering information from this dendrogram. Keep going. We're now down to 4 clusters and 3 clusters finally. You can see those clusters in color here. And then still 3 clusters, down to 2 clusters, and lastly down to 1 cluster forevermore. So I want you to focus on sort of this notion of persistence in the scale or in the horizontal direction. So you'll notice that there's a relatively long range of scales for which we have 3 clusters. All right. So that's maybe an argument for what you could make if you're trying to convince your friend, hey, I think there's really 3 groups of different types of data points here. You could argue that based on the stability in this horizontal direction of those 3 clusters, right? Whereas if you were arguing for 4 clusters, maybe your argument's not quite as valid because there's not as long of a window in scale for which you have 4 clusters. All right, so that's my introduction to hierarchical clustering. We count the number of clusters and track the clusters as the scale increases. And my introduction to single linkage clustering, which is just the simplest version of hierarchical clustering. And as I'll describe in the next video, is susceptible to some problems such as chaining. What public questions?
When you're trying to analyze that, like the persistence of clusters to see how many there are, does it matter if they occur at the same scale?
Say more.
So like, for example, that little triangle on the right-hand side there, yeah. That one has like, that cluster seems to persist for a really long time, but
Sure.
It's not persisting as a cluster in the scales where the other clusters, like when you made the argument for there are 3 clusters, the scales where that one is, yeah.
I see. So, right. So let's find this cluster of 3 data points. I see what you're saying, Sam. Okay, so this cluster of 3 data points, it sort of was a cluster over this regime, over this range, right? And Sam's pointing out that there was a lot of other noisy stuff going on elsewhere in the data set, okay? But Sam, I think you're totally right. You could still argue that this is a real cluster in your data because those 3 data points were together for a long time, even though other stuff was happening elsewhere. Yeah, you're totally right. It's sort of a more local view of persistence, right? This cluster, the 3 blue data points, was persistent over a range of scales, even though activity was happening elsewhere in the data set.